Thank you for joining us today on EarthFile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. Every December, scientists are asked if it was a bad year with respect to extreme weather. Unfortunately, they say the answer is increasingly clear. It's a yes. Fossil fuel emissions continue to rise, resulting in higher global temperatures and escalating climate extremes that bring relentless harm across every continent. The past 12 months have provided an unprecedented cascade of heat waves and floods, wildfires and droughts, underscoring the dangerous reality of living in a 1.3 degrees Celsius warmer world than when we started burning fossil fuels. Today, we'll look back at 2024 and some of the events that shaped it. Do stay with us.
For the first time, average global temperature exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels from 1850 to 1900, the upper limit set by the Paris Agreement. The agreement aimed to have countries work towards reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, with a goal of limiting the global average surface temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and striving towards keeping it well below 2 degrees Celsius. The high temperatures of 2024 crowned the last 10 years as the hottest on record.
I can officially report that we have just endured a decade of deadly heat. The top 10 hottest years on record have happened in the last 10 years, including 2024. This is climate breakdown in real time. We must exit this road to ruin, and we have no time to lose. In 2025, countries must put the world on a safer path by dramatically slashing emissions and supporting the transition to a renewable future. It is essential and it is possible.
In November, the European Union's Copernicus Climate Change Service warned that 2024 is on track to be the hottest on record and the first to cross 1.5 degrees Celsius. In 2023, the world registered a shocking record of 1.48 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level.
The science is clear. We are far off track from achieving global climate goals. 2023 was the warmest year on record by a huge margin. Leading international data sets say that the first 8 months of 2024 are also the warmest on record. There is an 80% chance that the global mean near surface temperature will temporarily exceed 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels at least one of the next 5 calendar years. But we need to be much more ambitious. The gap between aspirations and reality is a glaring one. Under current policies, there is a 2/3 likelihood of global warming of 3 degrees this century. Even at existing levels of warming, we are seeing increasingly destructive weather patterns, as witnessed by extreme heat and flooding we have seen in recent months. The climate crisis is worsening the inequality crisis. Once again, we are sounding the red alert for the planet.
Rising temperatures triggered extreme weather events across the globe in 2024, including deadly floods in Nigeria and Europe, devastating wildfires in South America, early heat waves, and catastrophic hurricane in the United States.
Standing on a stack of homemade sandbags in his flooded backyard, father of 7, Datubada, said the floods in Chad's capital had swept higher than previous years and called for better preparedness to address the perennial issue.
It's really complicated for us. We don't know what to do. We are forced to move, to find shelter somewhere. I've become a climate refugee and we're struggling with it. If only the authorities could find a solution in advance so that every year it wasn't just water and floods.
Chad,
Mali and Niger saw residents wade through flood waters or boats along submerged streets in recent weeks. Some of the 6.6 million people affected by West and Central Africa's monsoon, whose annual trail of destruction has become all too familiar.
Yes, I mean, if you monitor the West African monsoon system, you will notice that over the past 15 years or so, the West African monsoon system has been extremely active. That means that we have had torrential rainfall surpluses almost every year happening in West Africa during the summer season, especially between July and September.
In Nigeria, floods affected 1.3 million people across the 4 states and killed 320 people. While flooding is not uncommon in northern Nigeria, experts report that Maiduguri, the capital of Borno State, experienced its worst flood in 30 years.
I can say close to 40% of Maiduguri metropolitan town and Jere local government areas were severely affected. Thousands of persons were displaced, and then most of their homes were severely affected. It has completely disrupted the socio-economic activities in the state, especially when you go to the livestock market. Animals were completely flooded, food items were completely flooded, and above all, the loss of lives.
To build back better, the governor visited vital bridges including Gwanje Bridge, Fori Bridge and Murmuru Bridge, which connects Borno's metropolitan area. The tour also included critical government-owned facilities like the Gwanje Maternity Hospital to evaluate the extent of the damage and plan for rebuilding.
One thing we shall do is to stop people from building back inside the waterways. We shall never forfeit the lives and properties of the entire people of Maiduguri in order to support tiny elites, or I can say very few people, to come and build their homes inside the waterways. So on this note, I want to instruct the the State Ministry of Water Resources, Works and Housing, the Borno State Information Geographic System, as well as the Pilot Committee, the police, the DSS, and all other relevant security agencies to ensure that nobody is allowed to rebuild their homes that were built right inside the waterway. This is a warning signal to all of us. If we want to save the lives and properties of the people, then we must do the right thing by ensuring that nobody is allowed again to build inside the waterways. That's the message that I want to take across to the people of Maiduguri. And I want to re-emphasize this statement again, that yes, we experienced overflowing from the Alo Dam. Yes, we had the problem of breakage of Alo Dam. But believe me sincerely, the major reason why the entire town was submerged is as a result of a human factor. People decided to build inside the waterways. The width of the canal, the waterways, was drastically reduced. And then the water has no way to go rather than to, submerge the buildings.
Reports by World Weather Attribution highlights the urgent need to prepare for floods that have become regular occurrences due to fossil fuel-driven warming.
Wet months like this is actually relatively common. We expect similar 30-day accumulated rainfall around once every 3 years in the current climate. But to understand whether that observed trend can be attributed to climate change and to understand likely future changes, we combine those results from the observations with climate models. The majority of the climate models that we looked at indicate a trend towards more extreme rainfall events in this region. And overall, we estimate that the likelihood of wet months like this one has doubled due to climate change, and that the wettest month in each year is now about 10% wetter than it would have been without human-caused climate change.
The study highlights the critical need to improve flood defenses in regions of Africa that are now experiencing frequent floods. The failure of dams in Nigeria and Sudan came a year after Libya experienced its deadliest disaster when 2 dams collapsed after days of heavy rainfall intensified by climate change, killing more than 12,000 people. Dams need to be repaired, maintained and upgraded to cope with heavy rainfall that is increasing fossil warming, the researchers say.
But the floods of 2024 were not just a force of nature, but a reflection of deep-rooted vulnerabilities, amplifying pre-existing human suffering. These floods struck in regions already grappling with conflict, displacement, and fragile infrastructure, acting as risk multipliers. In Sudan, ongoing civil war and protracted humanitarian crisis meant that large segments of the populations were already displaced, making them especially vulnerable. The erosion of the protective status of humanitarian workers, including those under the Red Cross and Red Crescent emblems, further compound the crisis, putting their lives at risk while delaying critical deliveries of food, water, and medical supplies. Camps for internally displaced persons, constructed as temporary shelters, were severely damaged by the floods, leaving thousands more without shelter. Beyond conflict, poor urban planning and rapid growth in informal settlements in flood-prone areas heightened the exposure of vulnerable populations. In Nigeria, many of the most impacted areas had yet to fully recover from the 2022 floods, demonstrating a cyclical pattern of vulnerability. These regions, particularly in urban centers, often lack adequate drainage systems, leaving communities exposed to repeat flood events. Infrastructure failures, especially the collapse of parts of the critical dams in Sudan and Nigeria, served as stark reminders of the need for resilient water management systems.
The study highlights that climate change and conflict are a recipe for disaster. The floods in Sudan have taken place during an ongoing civil war in the country that has displaced more than 10 million people, leading to overcrowded camps, food shortages, and severe cholera epidemics. A violent insurgency has also forced nearly 2.4 million people from their homes in the Lake Chad Basin in West Africa. People affected by war have very limited means to deal with another crisis and can become trapped in desperate cycles of displacement, the researchers say.
We need to do a better job at protecting displaced populations from floods. And we can do this essentially by 2 different ways. So short-term solutions, obviously, and long-term planning. We need to set up safer shelters in more elevated areas, straying away from flood-prone zones and building really proper drainage systems. Again, we need to improve early warning systems, ensuring that these really incredibly vulnerable populations are reached by this critical risk information. Importantly, camps also need really clear evacuation plans and routes. If these are sustained camps, we need to invest in nature-based solutions, which can just be increasing vegetation to improve the absorptive capacity of the ground, also erecting barriers of different sorts. But on the broader scale, local governments, humanitarian actors, and communities must really work together to both plan for floods.
The study was conducted by 11 researchers as part of the World Weather Attribution Group, including scientists from universities and meteorological agencies in Sudan, Egypt, Kenya, the United States, the Netherlands,
and the United Kingdom.
Nearly 200 countries committed in the Paris Agreement to limit warming to as close to 1.5 degrees Celsius as possible. While these records do not mean we've breached the Paris Agreement target, scientists expect the world will cross that threshold by the early 2030s. Carbon dioxide emissions from burning coal, oil and gas are the main cause of global warming. The world is currently on track for as much as 3.1 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of this century, according to the 2024 United Nations Emissions Gap Report, with global greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuel use continuing to rise.
If we look at the progress towards 2030 targets, especially of the G20 member states that we focus on because collectively they account for nearly 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions, they have not made a lot of progress towards their current climate targets for 2030, and those targets in addition are not strong enough to get us anywhere close to where we need to be by 2030. So there's still an implementation gap between existing policies and NDC targets. Right now, countries are preparing their next climate plans and targets for 2035. All the targets will be for 2035. And if we look at the emissions gap, of course, we won't know what that is until we have the new climate plans in next year. But if we just assume that the current mitigation ambition is continued, then of course the emissions gap will grow even further by 2035. And that leaves us on track to global warming of up to 3.1 degrees Celsius during this century. And if the climate pledges that countries have currently made are implemented fully, so the unconditional and the conditional nationally determined contributions, we're looking at somewhere between 2.6 to 2.8 degrees Celsius.
I hereby invite the CMA to adopt the draft decision contained in document CMA/2024 L.22.
Countries at November's COP29 summit in Baku, Azerbaijan, adopted a $300 billion a year global finance target to help poorer nations cope with the impact of climate change. It's nowhere near the $1.3 trillion that is needed, and it is not debt-free, a deal its intended recipients criticized as woefully inadequate.
Your Excellency, trust is the basis for all action. And this incident is indicative of a lack of trust, a lack of collaboration on an issue which is a global challenge which is faced by all of us and most of all by the developing countries that are not responsible for it. But we've seen what you have done. However, would want to say that gaveling and trying to ignore parties from speaking does not behove the UNFCCC system, and we would want you to hear us and also hear our objections to this adoption. We absolutely object to this unfair means followed for adoption.
Should I remind us of what the convention says? That it noted that developed countries had the largest share of historical and current global emissions. This might be 1994, but it's still very current till now. It also said that the developed countries would take the lead, and this lead is climate finance. That the developing country is saying that it's taking the lead with $300 billion till 2035 is a joke. And it's not something we should take lightly. I do not think it's something we should clap our hands and force us to take it. I do not think so. I think we should rethink it. It's not just by putting it in our statements, but we have a right as countries to choose if we're going to take this or not. And I'm saying that we do not accept this. You expect us to have ambitious NDCs. The NCQG was supposed to enable us to have realistic finance goals. $300 billion is unrealistic.
After an exhausting 2 weeks of negotiations, fraught with geopolitical divide, and 2 days after the conference was scheduled to end, with 3 closing plenaries, COP29 presidents finally got an agreement in the early hours of Sunday, the 24th of November 2024.
We were all here the last few days, so we all know how very, very difficult it was. And yet we do feel that the result of today is actually exceptionally important. We are living in a time of truly challenging geopolitics, and we should simply not have the illusion that it will soon get better. So sealing a deal truly is exceptional. Last year I said that COP28 was the beginning of the end of fossil fuels. And what I would like to add now is that, in my view, COP29 will be remembered as the start of a new era for climate finance. And the European Union and its member states will continue to play a leading role. And we have worked hard with all of you to ensure that there is significantly more money on the table. We're tripling the 100 billion goal, and we feel it is ambitious, it is needed, it is realistic, and it is achievable. And we are confident that this will be a tale of delivery.
On Sunday, the 2nd of November 2024, the biggest conference on nature conservation worldwide, also known as COP16, came to a close, but participants stopped short of making a decision on one of the biggest asks of the summit, agreeing on a detailed plan to increase funding for biodiversity. The 16th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity was suspended by its president as negotiations ran almost 12 hours longer than planned, and delegates started leaving to catch flights. The exodus left the summit without a quorum for decision-making. The conference, the biggest meeting of its kind yet, with around 23,000 registered delegates, was tasked with assessing and ramping up progress toward an agreement reached in Canada 3 years ago to halt humankind's destruction of nature's bounty.
We really think that taking care of nature, reconnecting to nature, and conserving together within different peoples is peace building, and also will make us more resilient to climate change shocks that will also create more a broader context for conflict.
Meanwhile, the 5th United Nations Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee meeting, intended to yield a legally binding global treaty in Busan, South Korea, was meant to be the final one. However, countries remained far apart on the basic scope of a treaty and agreed only to postpone key decisions and resume talks, dubbed INC 5.2, to a later date.
Here in Busan, we have made progress by making and walking paths. Throughout, our achievements so far are important. They remain still insufficient. While our work has focused on finding points of contact, the famous landing zones, we have succeeded in many areas. However, there are critical matters still need to be agreed.
An option proposed by Panama, backed by more than 100 countries, would have created a path for a global plastic production reduction target, while another proposal did not include production caps. The fault lines were apparent in a revised document released on Sunday, the 1st of December, by the meeting's chair, which may form the basis of a treaty, but remains riddled with options on the most sensitive issues. A small number of petrochemical producing nations, such as Saudi Arabia, had strongly opposed efforts to reduce plastic production and have tried to use procedural tactics to delay negotiations.
the biggest challenges with creating awareness for the consequences of climate change is that many people think that the adverse effects are only in faraway countries, not directly touching our lives. But we are more impacted than we can imagine. So in this year, 2025, I hope you have enough resources to ditch dirty fuel, enough backup to stay in the light. And above all, may the climate be favorable to you in all seasons. From me, Ayola Kasim, and the FR crew here in Lagos, it's bye for now.